What I would like to do today is talk a little bit about the international nuclear nonproliferation regime. And within that context, North Korea's effect on that regime. Beginning with some of the principal challenges to the NPT, and focusing then on what our response needs to be. Let me start with the threats to the regime. There are a lot of observers in academia and in the policy community who believe that the NPT regime, which has served all of our countries very well since the treaty came into force in the early 1970s, but they believe that that regime is under terrific pressure, under great stress. And there are a number of reasons for that. Here are, at least as I see the challenges, the three principal threats to the long-term viability of the regime. Most people, when they think about nuclear proliferation, think about the threat from what has now long been called rogue states. States who have violated the NPT, and states that are aggressively pursuing a nuclear weapons capability. North Korea was a member of the NPT, but violated its obligations under the IAEA safeguards, violated its obligations on every agreement, quite frankly, that it signed related to nuclear weapons, and has moved very deliberately from what was an unclassified assessment by the U.S. intelligence agency in the year 2000, an assessment that the country possessed enough plutonium for 1 to 2 weapons, to, by the end of the Bush administration, enough plutonium for 6 to 12 weapons, depending how one divides up the plutonium in terms of the weapons design, to today where they have reportedly a very active high-enriched uranium facility to produce fissile material for nuclear weapons. At the same time, their missile program has continued, and North Korea has declared itself to be a nuclear weapons power, formally. Iran, you're all familiar with Iran as well. Iran's program was outed in the fall of 2002 and has moved steadily to acquire capabilities with the opening of the conversion facility, followed by the onset of enrichment of uranium. Iran continues to insist that its program is a peaceful program, that it's designed entirely for nuclear energy, but I think it is the view of most, and this is clearly seen in the UN Security Council resolutions that have been passed on Iran, that Iran does have a nuclear weapons capability or an aspiration for that capability. And there have been different assessments on the status of weaponization in Iran. Reportedly, the U.S. intelligence will have another NIE that will challenge some of the national intelligence estimate, that will challenge some of the conclusions of the last NIE with regard to weaponization. And then there's what I call the wannabes, those countries that very well may be pursuing nuclear weapons as we sit around this table. But the jury is still out in terms of how far they have moved forward. Syria, for example, did build in a very covert, clandestine fashion a plutonium-making facility, a reactor, with the assistance of North Korea. There have been rumors and reports about a startup program in Burma, and there's also concerns about other countries. But these are sort of the traditional concerns, the traditional threats facing the NPT. I mentioned this concern that the treaty may break down. There is, at least within academic circles, a number of observers on the left and on the right that believe that we could have a cascade of proliferation. That is, the number of nuclear weapon states could go up dramatically over the course of the next 5 to 10 years. In part, that depends on how successful we are in dealing with the threats from states like North Korea and Iran. And it's in part dependent upon how well we're able to manage this expansion of nuclear energy. There are about 36 countries who have expressed an interest, and some have begun to move forward, some very aggressively, to acquire the capability for producing nuclear energy through building reactors. How well we'll be able to control the spread of nuclear energy while managing the risk of proliferation is still very much an open question, and one that we need to think through and be very conscious of. And then there is the threat to the regime that comes from nuclear terrorism, the prospect for nuclear terrorism. It's interesting that you hear more about this threat in the United States than I think anywhere else. You do hear some of it in Russia, but primarily in the United States. In fact, it was the position of the previous President Bush that this was the preeminent threat that we face as a nation. And President Obama has taken the same position. He says this is the #1 threat that the United States faces, a terrorist with a nuclear weapon. And if you think that 9/11 was a game changer for the United States, think about a nuclear 9/11. That would be a world changer for the United States, and I think for the rest of the international community. And we need to be very conscious about that threat, because a number of terrorist organizations have not only indicated a willingness to pursue nuclear weapons, but they have moved forward in that in that desire to try to acquire a weapon, or at least the fissile material for a weapon. So these are the challenges. North Korea as a facilitator. How does North Korea affect these challenges to the global regime? North Korea is the principal purveyor of ballistic missiles, and has long been. And ballistic missiles are the weapon of choice for weapons of mass destruction. North Korea has provided ballistic missiles to a good number of other countries, sold them, of course, and many of us have drawn the conclusion that they are willing to sell to anyone that's got the currency to buy. And I think that's borne out by the facts. What's particularly troublesome is that North Korea has moved from providing ballistic missile technology and ballistic missile capabilities to providing nuclear technologies. And we see that with the relationship that it had with Syria in the construction of the nuclear reactor there that was bombed by Israel. In terms of how this facilitation might be affected in terms of the regime, well, if we are unsuccessful in dealing with the North Korean nuclear challenge, it could lead to significant proliferation in the region. The same is true with Iran. If we fail with Iran, if we fail to control the Iranian program, we could have significant proliferation in the Middle East and in the Gulf. A number of countries have been identified as possible candidates in the Gulf, including Saudi Arabia, and beyond the Gulf, Egypt and Turkey and others. And this could have a devastating effect on the NPT regime. In fact, the NPT regime would have little substance and little effect in terms of controlling proliferation if we were to see that happen. There's also implications for nuclear terrorism, because if you have an expansion of the number of states that are producing fissile material, the number of states that are acquiring nuclear weapons, the prospect that one of those weapons or more than one of those weapons could end up in terrorist hands goes way up. And again, North Korea has not demonstrated any restraint on the transfer of missiles or nuclear technology, and there are many who believe that North Korea could be tempted to sell a nuclear weapon to a terrorist. Or, alternatively, if there is an implosion, political implosion in North Korea, what happens to those weapons? Could those weapons become loose nukes and ultimately end up in the hands of terrorists? So that's sort of the framework of the challenges. What do we do about it? I joined the previous administration on the first day of office, and I'll never forget coming into my office that first day and finding one document on my desk, despite the fact that I had this whole bank of safes. There was only one document, and that was the Clinton policy directive on nonproliferation. And that directive basically had three components. One was export controls, to assist other countries in building effective export controls. The second was to expand the membership of the NPT, and at that time what that meant was try to convince the Israelis and the Indians and the Pakistanis, the only three countries who hadn't signed up to the NPT, to join. It was the universal sort of membership. There was never any suggestion that they would be successful in convincing the Indians and the Pakistanis and the Israelis to join, but that was part of the policy. And the third part had to do with non-Lugar or cooperative threat reduction. This is the program that was instituted following the fall of the Soviet Union to provide non-proliferation assistance to Russia and the other former Soviet states.